Hello chess friends and welcome to Azarov Chess channel and welcome to a truly remarkable strategic gameplay by the two legends of the sport. Welcome to a spectacular gameplay by Magnus Carlsen against Vasily Ivanchuk. The game was played in 2011 where Magnus was not the world champion in chess yet, but I think in 2011 Magnus was already the strongest player in the world. He just didn't have his title. He gained it of course in 2013 with a great win against Vishy Anand. And this game between Carlsen and Ivanchuk is, I think, also a certain clash of styles, because Magnus is of course the strategic endgame god that squeezes almost everything out of nothing, and Vasily Ivanchuk is of course the tactical beast that's always trying to spice up the game somehow by preparing some dirty tactics. So it's always a pleasure watching these two styles playing against each other. So let's see now what happened with white pieces. Magnus Carlsen opened with the move d4, knight to f6, c4. We have e6, knight to f3 by Magnus, the counter or anti-Nimzo Indian setup. We have a d5 French position into the queen's gambit decline, 3 knights variation. Now after move bishop to b4, we have the sharp Ragozin defense here by Vasily Ivanchuk. So this idea is of course to somehow put more pressure against this knight on c3, and also there is a certain tension in the center of the board. My recommendation, if you don't want to study so much theory with the white pieces against the Ragozin defense, go like Magnus Carlsen to this line after bishop to g5, knight from Bd7, simplify the game in the center by trading off the c4, the d pawn. I think it releases really now the pressure in the center of the board. The game is not so complicated, at least in an early state of the game. So we have e takes d5 by Vasil, we have queen to c2 by Magnus, and now c5. This is now the idea of the Ragozin defense. c5, breaking and entering, playing queen to a5, if possible also to put the knight on e4, putting more pressure simply against the knight on c3. The downside for black a little bit in this line is that you're leaving many times yourself an isolated d pawn after potential d takes c5. If we play d takes c5 later, then you're kept with an isolated d pawn, which could be then a strategic disadvantage through the whole game. We have d takes c5 by Magnus immediately, and you see now he's saying, okay, I have a weakness in your camp, I know what to do now against an isolated pawn. I should play a blockade, not allow you to advance the pawn, and maybe reach the endgame stage where this pawn could be vulnerable. So h6 by Vasily Ivanchuk, good move, forcing basically already a huge reaction by white. If for instance white goes with bishop to h4, things are getting already very tricky. Here, this wasn't played in the game, but I wanted to show you how tactical rich already the position can be, because you're not you have not retreated here to the square d2. For instance, if black is trying queen to a5, you're trying e3, knight to e4, bishop to d3, and now after knight to c3, you don't capture the knight on c3, of course. We play kingside castling, and the knight doesn't have good squares. If you play bishop to knight to e4, then bishop to e4, d takes e4, queen to e4 leads already into a very complicated game for black. I think black could be lost in a couple more moves. So even if you try here knight to b5, then a3 is going to happen, and then b4 we can also get the knight. The best way here maybe in this line for black is to play simply knight to a2. White will get the piece back, but at least you gain now some pawns as a compensation. So as I said, Magnus didn't want to go into this line because he knows his theory, of course, and played now simply bishop to d2. Kept, of course, his bishop close enough to the action here around the square c3. We have kingside castling, and now e3. Magnus is controlling the d4 square. The player that has an isolated d pawn wants, of course, to advance the pawn, wants to break and enter somehow, but you see so far it's not possible because of this great grip around the square d4. We have bishop to c5 by Vasily Ivanchuk, rook to c1, queen to e2, queen to e7, bishop to e2, and now a6. Queen to d3 by Magnus has been played in chess history. I see now 2 games in the database, 1 game ended in a draw. Magnus is now attacking the d5 pawn, forces again here Vasily Ivanchuk to react, plays now knight to b6 in order to protect the pawn on d5. Castling, and I think in this position we could say this is an equal position because, okay, black has this disadvantage of the isolated d pawn, but I would say black has a better piece activity, especially when we watch now the bishop's activity of white. The bishop's activity is not good. The bishop of the light square bishop is blocked out by its own queen, and the bishop on d2 is always a little bit paralyzed by its own knight and also by the pawn on e3. So it's not really the optimal bishop pair that Magnus Carlsen has here. So I think black has a good compensation in piece activity for the strategic disadvantage of an isolated d pawn. We have bishop to g4. Theoretical novelty by Vasily Ivanchuk in chess history. Bishop to e6 has been also played in one game. Okay, bishop to g4, also very solid. Nothing wrong here by Vasily Ivanchuk, because as we said, his main strategic goal is to advance the pawn on d4, and the key defender of the d4 square is, of course, the knight on f3. So that's why with some ideas, rook to d8, bishop takes f3 and d4, maybe Vasily Ivanchuk calculated some dangerous tactics here on the d file. We have knight to d4 by Magnus. Magnus is not allowing that. Bishop to d7. If you play here bishop to e2, then knight to e2 again is the same strategy, I would say. Again, white is controlling the d4 square, and now in this scenario, I think black will never be able anymore to push the pawn on d4, because now we have also this knight supporting, this knight on b3 can come. We have the queen, the pawn controlling the d4 square. I think in this scenario, black is going to be left with an isolated d pawn through the whole game. So after knight to d4 by Magnus, Vasily Ivanchuk retreated to d7, bishop to f3, rook to e8, and now b3, controlling the very important square c4, because this would be an optimal square now for black's knight. Bishop to a3, hitting the rook. Magnus lifts the rook to c2, rook from a to c8, and now knight to e2. You see, when you play against the isolated d pawn, you don't have to, I don't know, I would say calculate too much, because if you reach now the fully endgame stage without any minor pieces, without the rooks, without the queen on the board, then black will have still his problem with an isolated d pawn. So black has to make something with his piece activity if black wants to do something in this game. So that's why going into an endgame is a good strategic idea here for white. White wants to, as I said, simply trade off rooks, trade off knights, trade off everything, and we'll have, I think, then a beautiful endgame. So rook to c2, queen to c2, bishop to e6. You could here try bishop to knight takes e6, f takes e6, but then it gets very dangerous, because then e5 could happen, and suddenly it's not an isolated d pawn anymore. Black will have the hanging pawn structure in the center of the board, which is a mobile structure, which is a dynamic structure, which could, of course, cause some positional problems in white's position. You could maybe go into this line with knight to e6, f takes e6. If you have the ability maybe to place your queen on b3, then it would be very tough for black to push the pawn on e5. Then maybe this pawn on d5 could be won. But Magnus is saying, okay, still, I'm not rushing. He played bishop to c1, simply played on his strategic idea, trade off more pieces, going into an endgame stage, and then get simply a better endgame because of the isolated pawn. We have rook to c8, good counter-attack here by Magnus, queen, bishop to a3, hits, of course, also the queen, queen to a3, and now queen to d2. Here the problem for black is that you cannot play now knight takes e4. You would love to do that, but then after bishop to e4, d takes e4, knight to e6, f takes e6, you have two weaknesses now. Knight to f4, knight to d4 is working, so in my opinion, not a good continuation anymore here for black. This is simply too much to handle then in the later stage of the game. So after queen to d2, we have bishop to g4, bishop takes g4, and now knight to g4. And we have reached now an almost fully endgame stage, I would say. Nothing complicated so far, I think, in the position. As I said, the engine gives here equal chances. I think, okay, white is slightly better because of this isolated pawn. But I would not say that this is completely winning or something here for white. But you see now how beautiful Magnus Carlsen will play now this endgame. He will show here really his great endgame skills. In my opinion, very one of the greatest chess games that I've seen by Magnus Carlsen. So after knight to g4, we have knight to f5. Magnus activates the knight on a better square. We have knight to f6, h3, creating some breathing spaces for the king. king to h7, queen to d4, attacking the knight. You cannot take, of course, here the pawn on a2. Your knight is hanging, then also this pawn is hanging. Then you could lose also the battle on the 7th rank. So it's simply not working here for black. So that's why knight from b to d7. We have queen to f4. Beautiful move here by Magnus. Not worrying about the pawn on a2, because if you play now queen takes a2, then there is this problem. Knight to d6, attacking the rook. Now the knight is coming here on d4. You're trying maybe b5, and now rook to c1 activates the rook. And actually in this scenario, although down a piece, white would simply win the battle on the open c file. And now when the rook comes on the 7th rank, I think it's a position that's not good anymore here for black. So in my opinion, good choice here by Vasily Ivanchuk not to take here the pawn on a2. After queen to f4, Vasily Ivanchuk played knight to f8, knight to g3 by Magnus. We have here knight to g6, and now another beautiful move here by Magnus, queen to d4. Magnus is not worrying about his pawn on a2. Let's see now again what happens. If you play queen to a2, then knight takes g7, knight to f5 is, I think, simply winning the game here for white. I think in the next couple of moves, black will simply resign. So you don't have time. That's the beauty about these moves by Magnus Carlsen. He played actively with his pieces, but never allowed here Vasily Ivanchuk to take the pawn on a2. Queen to c5. We have f3. As I said, every trade of pieces is favorable for white, because white will simply reach the endgame stage and will battle against the isolated d-pawn. So here we have here queen to d4, knight takes d4. Of course, you don't want to take with the pawn. Then you have yourself an isolated d-pawn. So that's why after knight to d4, Magnus is also controlling now the c2 squares, not allowing here Vasily Ivanchuk to get this rook on the most optimal rank. So we have knight to e5 by Vasily Ivanchuk, rook to d1, controlling the d3 square. Great restriction ideas here by Magnus Carlsen. G6, Vasily Ivanchuk is doing the same. It's not allowing Magnus to jump on the active f5 square. So we have king to f2, getting the king closer, because you're now in the endgame stage, and the king is supposed to play in the endgame stage. So knight to e2, king to f8, g4, knight to c6, and now rook to c1. Magnus is using now the pin, and you see now, although Magnus has always this d-pawn as a strategic goal, but it's not so easy to play this game because you don't have so many pieces anymore on the board. No really tactics are working here, so you have to just really struggle here to squeeze water out of the stone somehow here. I think this is very perfect example how to play such endgames. King to e7, h4. We have king to d6, and now h5. Great move by Magnus. For instance, if you take g takes h5, this wasn't played in the game, but I was really curious what would be going on here if Vasily Ivanchuk would have taken the pawn on h5. Then knight to f5, you have to step back with the king. Now we play g takes h5, knight to h5. The rook is coming, rook takes h6. So you see, in this scenario, I think again white gains a beautiful activity, and again, I would not say completely winning or something, but it's hard to play now for black. You have to go with your knight somewhere, then this other knight is coming. You have to protect the d5 pawn. Now we kick away the knight. You try maybe a check. In one moment, you have to step back with your knight, and now after knight to d5, at least white gained the pawn. Again, I'm not saying this is completely winning, but in top GM level, I think Magnus Carlsen would have a win here for sure. So here after move h5, that's why knight to e7. Vasily Ivanchuk noticed the problems of the f5 square. We have rook to h1, g takes h5, g takes h5, rook to g8, knight to g3, rook to g5, controlling also the f5 square again, but also attacking now the weak pawn by Magnus Carlsen, the weak pawn on h5. We have b4, controlling the king. The king, if the king gets on c5, then it could be again very dangerous here for Magnus. So it's really a crazy endgame here played by these two legends. So king to d7, rook to h4, rook lift. Beautiful move. Magnus is trying to get the rook on the f file, where it could attack the rook, but also it could attack the weak pawn on f7. Knight to e8, rook to f4, knight to d6. Vasily Ivanchuk is protecting the pawn, but also gets a new powerful square for the knight. The beautiful c4 square. Magnus goes with a4, b6 by Vasily Ivanchuk, a5. So you see after b takes a5, b takes a5. Again, a tough position now to play. what should black play? In the game f5, played by Vasily Ivanchuk, Magnus goes with rook to h4, and now knight to c4. Played by Vasily Ivanchuk, and believe me or not, this was now Ivanchuk's first mistake in the game, and I guarantee you, I think 70-80% of any players would play knight to c4, going for the a5 pawn, but actually it's a huge mistake. The best choice actually for Vasily Ivanchuk is was here to activate the rook again on a better file, because here if knight to e2 is for instance going to play, then rook to b8 is simply activating the rook, and now Magnus would also have to bring his rook into the defense. You can maybe play, I don't know, rook to b2 here is also perfectly fine. King to g3, you go for the pawn. Magnus also, for instance, activates his rook, gets the king closer, so at least something. But in this scenario, you would actually have a good control with your knight, because you're not allowing this rook to play, and you gain the pawn. As I said, nothing dramatically is going on, but this was maybe a choice here for Vasily Ivanchuk. But instead of this move rook to g8, he played simply knight to c4. And as I said, you see now how really Magnus Carlsen is great in endgames. He plays now, of course, here the move f4, kicks away the rook. Now the f5 pawn is hanging. Magnus retreats first of all to h3, because this is now a more important pawn. If this pawn is lost, then also the pawn on h6 is weak, and this advanced h5 pawn is close enough to the action, could be also promoted in the next couple moves. So very tricky stuff that actually knight to c4 is not working here for Vasily Ivanchuk. Knight to d6, again, he noticed his mistake. We have rook to h1. You see Vasily Ivanchuk had to protect now the pawn on f5. We have rook to g8. Now Vasily is trying to again include the rook into the attack, but it's a little bit slow now. Now it's not working. Now Magnus took over on the b file, and from this point on, I think the game becomes a one-way ticket in white's favor. So really crazy how these endgames are played, how basically the seemingly good move is not working here in this position. So rook to a8, Vasily Ivanchuk has to now protect the pawn on a6. We have king to f3, king to c7, knight to e6 by Magnus, king to c8, knight to c5, and now Vasily Ivanchuk forced the trades of rooks. Even if you go here with king to c7, even if you don't trade off the rooks, then the rook is coming on a very active square on b6 here. You're trying to attack it, then we deliver a check, then it may be a check, and we simply can also go afterwards this one. But I think again you have to worry simply about your f5 pawn. So here after move knight to c5, we have rook to b8 by Vasily Ivanchuk. Magnus took. Here Magnus finally took the pawn on a6. We have now knight to b4, knight to c4 by Vasily Ivanchuk. He probably calculated, okay, you got your pawn, but I get also my pawn back because I attacked you now. But Magnus simply advanced it. He says, you have to lose time. You have to lose precious time if you want to take the pawn. Meanwhile, while you bother with the pawn on the a file, I'm going to do something on the other side of the board. So it's not so easy to get your pawn back here. So we have king to b6. We have king to e2. Magnus is, of course, trying to get the king closer. Now the king is closer to the action. Gets simply on the most active square on d4 here. We have knight to b5. We have knight to e2. King to a5, and now a beautiful move here by Magnus, knight to c3, sacrificing the knight. Of course, Vasily calculated that this is not working, because if you play now here king to b4, then knight to b5, king takes b5, and a7 is game over here for black. The knight is not close enough to the pawn, cannot here compete against the potential promotion on the a file. So knight to c3, great move by Magnus. We have knight to c7. Magnus takes out now the pawn on d5, sacrifices now the knight, and now plays a beautiful a7, which makes again this knight deflected from the action, and now Magnus has access to the beautiful d4 square. Vasily Ivanchuk goes for the pawn on a7 with the move king to b6, but now Magnus took out now this pawn, and this is game over here for black, because after knight to d5, Magnus goes for this one, king to g6, knight takes e3, and after king to h6, in this particular position, Vasily Ivanchuk resigns. So let's see some options here. If you play knight to f5, then we go with king to g6. If you try to play something like knight to e7, then king to g5 is simply winning the game. In order to control the h6 square, you have to play knight to g8 or something, then h6. You sack the knight maybe with take, and now this pawn is rolling, it's simply unstoppable. After king to g5, you could maybe try to get the king closer, but as I said, then h6 is again a winning here for white. So great game, great strategic game, great endgame tactics in the end by Magnus Carlsen. In my opinion, very, very beautiful game, because it seemed though that this is really equal, nothing dramatic is going on, but how Magnus is spicing up this endgame is very incredible. So really, in my opinion, one of the greatest strategic games played by one of the greatest chess players, Magnus Carlsen. So, okay, I hope that you enjoyed this game. I really enjoyed it a lot. Interesting ideas of the Ragozin Defense for sure. If you want to see more beautiful games from chess history, check out our commented chess games and also our best chess games of all time series. And if you like this content, hit the subscribe button. See you soon with some more videos, and what do we say in the end? Chess is the best, of course.